Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the Zero Trust Summit. Cloud Security Alliance does a really nice job on these events. I encourage you to keep attending. So, this session is about Zero Trust and its relationship to resilience. We're actually in the midst of a pretty significant effort to demonstrate how Zero Trust fulfills the desire to build a resilient enterprise. So we'll talk through that. We'll talk through what we're doing and, kind of give you the essence of what's going on. I'm your presenter, Alex Sharp. I lead the resilience efforts for Cloud Security Alliance. I also co-chair two of the working groups, and I have my own consulting firm. The most valuable thing on this slide is really the LinkedIn and the contact information. Now, feel free to use your smartphone, connect with me on LinkedIn, save the email. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions, you're interested in participating, feel free to reach out. Even if I'm not the right person, I'll put you in touch with somebody who is. To go through this, we only have a half an hour. It's a very deep subject. It's a very important subject. We're going to really go through in four pieces. We'll talk about the background motivation. We'll talk about what resilience is, what it's not. We'll talk about objectives. And then we'll talk about the structure of the document we're putting together for Cloud Security Alliance and how you can help. The external motivation really comes from a variety of places, both national, international, and standards bodies. A few years ago, the US president kicked off an effort with their Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology to look at resilience, specifically how the digital world and the physical world impact each other. The results of that got transformed into the National Resilience Strategy, and the principles were baked into our national cybersecurity strategy. What's interesting is these efforts were one of the few remnants of the Biden administration that were not unraveled with the Trump administration. So they remain in place. They're still very significant. We also have seen over the past bunch of years that a lot of resilience principles have been finding their way into legislation, regulations, and standards. If you look at the list of examples, we've all heard about supply chains, we've heard about making risk based decisions. While we realize it or not, we've seen trends towards cross sector cooperation. We've seen trends looking towards developing leading indicators instead of lagging indicators. We and then we have this concept that's been developed over the years, minimum viable operating capabilities or a minimum viable business. So the idea is instead of treating your enterprise as either on or off, your services as being delivered or not, we look at it on a spectrum and determine on that spectrum what is viable. So these are all the kind of changes we're seeing in the industry, and they're coming at us from a variety of different places. And like I said, we also see a lot of work at the international level. As a matter of fact, a lot of the base work actually came out of England, particularly out of one of the banks from the Bank of England. It's really driving this. But the EU has a bunch of compliance regulations and acts out there like DORA and NIS2 and the Cyber Resilience Act. Plus, we see folks like Canada have done their own, what's known as E21. And then the international standards have been developing in this space for quite some time. So there's been a lot of stuff happening. Then piling on to that, we have all the stuff in the news. Right. Most recently, we saw about Anthropic with the agents being used by malicious actors to have basically automated cyber attacks. Now, this has been predicted for years, and we're finally seeing it. It finally happened in a big way. But we've seen other incidents, right? We have Stuxnet, where Iran accused the US in cooperation with Israel of destroying their nuclear program by putting bad code inside of some of their centrifuges. We saw the situation with Hezbollah earlier this year with radios and pagers exploding. And over the years, we've seen all sorts of different types of attacks, right? Penetrations into our telephone systems. We've seen attacks on water supplies and dams. We saw Russia attacking the Ukrainian power grid probably about eight years ago for the first time. So all this has really created a groundswell to look at it. Now, this resilience effort I lead for CSA is actually a collaboration amongst different parts of CSA. Within CSA, it came together with probably two areas really like dinking it over the net. The first is the Financial Services Leadership Council performed a survey on resilience, which had some interesting results. And about that same time, one of the other Zero Trust working groups came out with a piece on the role of Zero Trust in protecting critical infrastructure. So CSA kicked off this effort. And again, it's co led by Zero Trust and Financial Services. The Financial Services Leadership Council meets once a quarter. We brief them, obviously. The working group meets on alternative Fridays. By the time, this is pre recorded. So when you hear this, this is going to be the Friday right after the summit. Feel free to join us. Meets every other Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. If you haven't volunteered already, feel free to use that link. Go to the orange bar, click on the page, and volunteer. Even if this is not exactly the kind of thing you want to be volunteering for, if there's some other working group or effort you'd like to pay attention to or like to contribute, feel free. We're always looking for good volunteers. There's always a need for good people. So the schedule, just to kind of round out where we're going with this, version 1.0 will be released in Q1. We have also done a number of things throughout the year. The summit is one of them. We've actually got two resilience pieces going on. We've got this keynote, and then we also have a panel, which I believe was actually scheduled on the agenda for before now, specifically on resilience with a great set of panel members. I'd encourage you to see it at least. If you haven't, get it on video. Plus, we did a blog back in September that's effectively an executive summary to the document. Early 2025, so almost a year ago, we did a session during FinCloud Friday. Now, the document's been out for review for roughly 6 weeks when it's being presented, and comments do close on Friday. If you can, if you haven't already, feel free to dive in, make some contributions. Like anything else, there will be a version 2. So if you pick up the document and you see something that you think should be added, please let us know. It'll be in a future release. So, in addition to having it public comment, we also ran a couple of drop in sessions. We're basically walking through and soliciting comments and feedback. Plus, we did a couple of select sessions with some SME. So, what is resilience? And we'll also talk about what it's not. Simple. It's the ability to remain viable amidst adversity and to be better for it. Most people look at that and go, okay, what's the better for it part? That's the part that usually gets in your head. We use tabletops, practicing like we do with incident response. We use near misses, and we use incidents as an opportunity to learn and improve. So instead of waiting for an incident and marching through the incident and then having a post-mortem, we actually look very aggressively towards tabletops and near misses. I forgot who said it, but it was something like a smart man learns from their mistakes, a wise man learns from the mistakes of others. That's a fundamental principle in resilience. The idea is you keep on improving, you keep on learning. And again, the idea is to remain viable amidst adversity, not just waiting for things to happen and recover. We try to minimize the impact and we try to keep on going, kind of like the Energizer Bunny. The military has exercised this kind of practice for quite some time, usually in more of a kinetic sense than a digital kinetic sense. They tend to refer to it as mission assurance. You've probably heard that term if you've been around. Concepts are basically the same, principles are basically the same. The context and the terminology is very different, but what you're trying to do is remain viable, has not changed between the military look at it and what we see in the commercial space. One thing that is arising is we traditionally treat the military defense and the relationship with the commercial sector is kind of two different things. But as the world continues to evolve and things continue to happen the way they're happening, we need to recognize that one is actually dependent on the other. So, like military bases, all have their own power sources, they're independent, they have water, they have everything, but the communities around them aren't. And with most of the military living off base, it would affect them and their families. And then in times of war, when we're deploying forces or munitions, we still rely on commercial carriers, right? So that interrelationship needs to be addressed in a bigger way. Let's talk about what resilience is not. Short answer, it's not BCDR on steroid. It's just not. In BCDR, business continuity, disaster recovery, you're either alive or dead. You're either viable or you're not. And it's a very reactive strategy. So, disaster recovery is the recovery of IT after a disruptive event. Business continuity is a resumption of operations after a disruptive event. What we're doing in the resilience world is we aim to remain viable during the disruption. So just because something has happened to our organization, whether it be benign or malicious, an active attack or human error, whatever it is, instead of being totally offline, we remain viable. And how do we do that? Well, let's take an example first before we go into the how. Think of municipal water. We all need water to live. So let's say your municipal water system is offline for whatever reason, whether it be a malicious cyber attack, a human error, an accident of some sort, whatever. Water's just not getting to where it needs to go. Well, let's say we've sat down and we said our constituents can't be without water for more than 8 hours, right? You can argue about the numbers, they're in the right ballpark, but the concept's the same. Hospitals and emergency services need water within 2 hours. Commercial buildings tend to start going offline after 4 hours without water. And I'll say these are kind of made up numbers, but they're consistent with what municipalities and emergency services usually put in place. So, what do? We set priorities. We say emergency services like fire, police, hospital, they need water quickly. We stack rank priorities. Even within inside of commercial buildings, some buildings are more important than others. So we stack rank them in terms of priority. And those are the ones that we look at making viable. Again, we look for ways to keep them viable during that transition period. So maybe the emergency services needs to have enough water in trucks that they can rely on to last for 2 hours. Hospitals, maybe they need to keep 8 hours of water supply on premise that they can get access to. And by stack ranking commercial buildings, we can figure out who needs fresh water when. And then for our constituents, we can bring it in through trucks and bottled water. All right, that's kind of a rough plan, but you get the idea, right? So you're remaining viable. One hospital I deal with, because of needing to get workers to and from the hospital during emergencies, or whether it be a weather condition or what have you, they actually went so far as to buy a gas station. So they've always got plenty of gas. That is a very novel way of treating it, but it's not what we talked about in the past, like, oh, let's wait till we restore. No, you have to remain viable. Key point. In the resilience world, we also know that historically we've relied very heavily on technical controls. We basically took technical defenses, we built a very strong wall, we pointed it at the adversary and said, hit me here. Well, they figured that out. Now, north of 90% of the attacks actually begin with a social engineering attack. And if you look at the numbers, some people claim 98 or even 100% of all attacks involve attacking a human with some sort of social engineering. So they figured our strongest defense is our technology. So, yay us for doing a good job in that. Now the adversary is moving on to the next weakest piece, which is the human. Bruce Schneer, who you've probably all heard of, great author in this space, very much a thought leader. has always said that amateurs hack systems, professionals hack people. Resilience is specifically designed for those kind of models. You probably all recognize the cyber life cycle with the cybersecurity framework on top. Three basic phases, excuse me, protect, detect, recover. And then underneath, we have the different dimensions of technology, people, process, organization. In a resilience world, we look at the entire cyber life cycle. We look up and down the full stack. So historically, like we said, we spent a lot of time in the protection phase, mostly with technology, recognizing we now need to fold in people, process, organization, but we also need to move down the cyber life cycle. A boom happens, we need to detect it. We get into the recovery phase where even only a few years ago we would scramble. Most organizations have really improved this. This is probably one of the best things that came out of everything we've dealt with ransomware. But it really has gotten our recovery activities better aligned. The other thing we've learned is that the greatest damage actually occurs after the recovery. So, with a long tail item and hurting our digital trust. So, for example, in 2013, we had the famous incident with Target where Target was breached because of an HVAC vendor. The people that handle their heating, ventilation, air conditioning were actually compromised. Malicious actor came through and stole a pile of stuff, credit cards and the like from Target. What's not often talked about is that attack in 2013. The last lawsuit was settled in 2024, 11 years later. So when we talk about minimizing the blast radius, we're even trying to take the blast radius back of these long tail items like litigation and loss of goodwill. Let's talk about objectives of resilience. There's really five things we're trying to eliminate, and they all kind of make sense when you think about single points of failure, right? Look at what happened when AWS went out and then Microsoft followed. And the day we're recording this as Cloudflare is out, right? We see those ripple impacts. We also know that with more and more of our businesses putting more and more in the cloud, we are aggregating risk in the cloud. That's only one example. We have counterparty risk, which is a very old term. It became popular in financial services. Don't confuse it with financial services only. It's a type of risk, it's a risk concept. Think about your supply chain, think about your vendors. Those people are your counterparty in a transaction. They are a counterparty risk for you. Contagion is when something happens in one part of your ecosystem and propagates through. It's kind of like somebody coming to work and sneezing and coughing in the office, and the next day, you know, over the next couple of weeks, everybody's homesick. All right, that's contagion. Good example of that I like because it's very memorable for me. It's during the pandemic. Northern Italy shut down, ripples through the supply chain. Basically, every pharmaceutical and medical supplier on the planet found out they were sourcing materials from Northern Italy and never know it. Never know it. That's contagion. Cascading risk is very, very important to us as cyber professionals. Why? There are approximately 100 risks that a business needs to manage. And according to risk management frameworks, cyber is only one risk. Now, we professionals know there's a lot of pieces under that, but it's only one risk. Interesting thing about that single risk, it propagates and cascades into everything else. So a cyber incident can make its way into the physical aspects of taking your manufacturing offline, like we saw with Colonial Pipeline. It can take transportation systems down, like we saw with the airlines with CrowdStrike. We can go right on down the list. And sometimes it's a little funny. With AWS going out, it hit me personally because I went to my dry cleaner to pick up some laundry. And guess what? The point of sale system was off. Little Googling, found out, guess where it was hosted. There was also an incident, if anybody can confirm this, so it'd be great. Those fancy beds you can raise and lower your heads and feet and all and change the temperatures. Well, some of them were stuck in position because apparently the app was using cloud providers. Right? These are cascading risks. So your risks, your cyber risk can impact your supply chain. It can impact your goodwill. It can impact your credit rating. It can impact your stock price. It can impact every other risk in your risk register. Resilience is incredibly important. Some people call this cyber resilience. Whatever term you use, cyber is incredibly important to this world we live in today. And what do we do when you look at these five areas? Nothing new. We are controlling our blast radius to reduce the impact, and we are doing everything we can to reduce the likelihood, recognizing a certain amount of incidents will occur. To do this, one of the most important things we need to do is to establish our business priorities. Not all products, services, and processes are as important as the other. If you're a bank, and let's say you have three pieces, you have a retail piece, where people go to the local branch, you cash checks, you get cash out, whatever you're going to do there. You talk to your friends, say hi to the teller, right? You have that business. You have a mergers and acquisition piece, and then you have an investor relations trading piece. Well, if you've got an outage, the average consumer is going to be more concerned about the retail piece. The investors are going to feel better if they can go online, look at their accounts, and know the balances are still there and they haven't lost any assets. There's no run on the bank. They'll feel good with that. Mergers and acquisitions, your average consumer doesn't even know it's part of the bank. Let's face it, right? So they can be offline for a few days, right? That's figuring out those priorities are very, very important. Then, when you know those priorities, you look at the components underneath the people, the process, technology, organizational dimensions that cooperate to make that happen, and the dependencies. Think about the dependencies for a second. You could do everything you need to do to bring an application back online, but if your identity and access management system is offline, nobody can get to the application anyhow. Doesn't matter. If you have a data center, many data centers these days have dedicated networks for doing backups and restores. Well, if that's offline, it doesn't matter that you have this fantastic storage system because you can't get to it, right? Those dependencies we think about in a resilience context. We also think about restoration sequence because some things need to be brought online at different rates, and we don't have resources in the real world to bring everything online at all the time, right? So that's a big part of resilience. Phil Venables has this fantastic quote that I think pretty much I use in every presentation these days, right? Which is about aligning the tone at the top with the resources in the ranks. We talk about business alignment, and cyber is now a business conversation. That alignment is incredibly important because it establishes our priorities. It helps us determine our dependencies. Without these two pieces working together, the business drivers and the technology, we can't do it. Right. So I love that quote. Now, in a resilience context, you can't always eliminate everything. NASA can't. So, likelihood of us doing it, we can't. I heard a quote once that said space shuttle missions, on any given mission, there's about 100 risks that they can't mitigate. They don't have a backup for because it's just not viable. It doesn't exist. Right. So, what do? We look at throttling services. Eh, so maybe our turnaround instead of being 5 minutes is 15. Instead of having your call answered in 30 seconds, it's an hour, right? You start looking at throttling services. You also look at priorities. You also look at which constituents are more important, right? So you have to make these decisions. We also look at how do we remain viable? How do we continue to operate during these situations? Do we go back to paper? Do we call in extra help, like Christmas help? Do we recover out of region or do we transfer workloads to other regions? Right. So we think about this stuff, and by designing it in from day one, we know what we're going to do and we know how to respond. Change healthcare. Everybody here has probably heard of it. One out of three Americans, so like over 100 million. I laugh because the size of this is just, it's mind boggling, right? They were offline for 6 weeks. They had no plan. What do we do? I don't know. I get how they get there. I know how it happens. We all know how it happens, right? But we also know that when it happens, you think back and go, "Oh my God, why didn't I think of that?" Right? It's just kind of the nature of the beast. Change healthcare ended up being a single point of failure. So we think about it throughout and it goes, "What happens if? How do we survive if this is out?" So again, remaining viable. Expect the unexpected, presume incidents are going to happen, place greater priority on third parties because we're seeing a big impact from them. We also think how third parties that we rely on have to participate during recovery. And then think about what's viable, what are our priorities, and how do we operate. The supply chain is very, very complex. We have these nth levels. We're actually seeing one out of every three incidents these days is coming from the supply chain. I suspect when the numbers come out for 2025, that number will be higher. We also know one out of eight incidents are coming from the software supply chain, right? So we're talking about big numbers here and huge dependency on third parties. Let me spend 2 minutes on the document itself. I'm very happy to say we had all the right participants. Just about every major industry body working on resilience or having a model or having a contribution was recruited and participated in the effort. I like to say, tongue in cheek, we have all the right people on the bus and in the right seats. We also had a nice mix of government and commercial. We had a very nice mix of industry participants, many cross sectors up and down the chain. We had the head of resilience for multi-billion-dollar companies. We had people that were actually designing and operating the systems. And we've hit every major region except Latin America. So if you're from Latin America and interested in participating, we'd love to have you. And here's a list. Like I said, a lot of people contributed. There's an expression, you go faster by yourself, but you go further together. Clearly, an example of what we did here. The primary audience were practitioners like yourself. Secondary audience were the people you work with and you depend on, like your senior leadership, regulators. We focus very heavily on plain language, and everything is very well cited with lots of additional resources if you want further study or to dive into a certain area. Table of contents for your perusal. And in the future, there's a few areas that I want to see us work on for the next version. Take the indicators and metrics up a level. We need more work on software supply chain. We have to clarify what we mean with automation and AI. I'd like to clarify or enhance the BIA section just because it's so critical of what's going on here. And then build out things like security by design default, cyber informed engineering, site reliability engineering. Again, here's my contact information. Connect on LinkedIn, use my email, whatever. We'd love to have folks volunteer and contribute. If you have any thoughts, comments, feedback, you have a colleague you think would be good for us to work with, feel free to reach out. Anything we can do. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of the summit.